Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's program. We see some people coming in, so we'll give everyone about a minute or two until we begin. Good afternoon to those of us joining right now. We'll give everyone a couple of minutes before we start today's program. Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see you too, Jewel, virtually. I see your name. Good afternoon to those of us joining right now. We're going to give everyone about a minute or two before we begin. Welcome to those of us who are joining. We're going to give everyone about one more minute so we can also be respectful of everyone's time. So let's begin, and more people will be joining us shortly, but we just want to be respectful of everyone's time. So good afternoon. Welcome to today's program. As always, we're very delighted to have you all here today. My name is Bora, and I'm the Assistant Director of Programs and Director of Studies at the Tower Center. A little bit about how today is going to go. I'll introduce our moderator, who many of you are very familiar with, and then he'll introduce our speaker. After our speaker presents, we'll have a short moderated discussion followed by Q&A. So we ask you to please put your questions in the Q&A function. And if you can't find the Q&A function, please use the chat and we'll answer the questions through there as well. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Hiroki Takaouchi. He is a senior fellow at the SMU Tower Center and also the director of the Sun and Star program on Japan and East Asia. Hiroki, I will now turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Bora. Thank you, Bora, for organizing this event. Good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to a SoundStar webinar. Today, we are talking about China, especially China's political participation and rights. This is a very interesting topic, and then also this is not a straightforward topic because China is an authoritarian country. Before starting, I'd like to thank Japan Airlines for their generous support for SMU Tower Center and SMU in Japan Summer International Studies Program at the Kansei Gakuin University. Particularly today, I'd like to thank Japan Airlines and then its staff at the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport office for supporting Dr. Wu when he came to Dallas from Japan last July. Dr. Wu, today's speaker, is currently a visiting scholar of the SMU Tower Center. And he is a visiting scholar in residence. He and his family came to Dallas from Japan last July. You can see how difficult it was for him to come to the United States together with his family. So I truly appreciate the support from the Japan Airlines when he traveled to Dallas. Dr. Mao-sung Wu is currently associate professor of Keio University, Japan. And he has received the PhD of political science from Keio University. He was originally from China. He is Korean Chinese, and he grew up in Jilin province in China. After finishing his undergraduate in China, he came to Japan to do a PhD program of political science at Keio University. So and then he came to Japan. So he speaks, his original languages are Chinese and Korean, and then he speaks Japanese, as he wrote a dissertation on Chinese politics in Japanese. And then now he came to the United States, and so English is his fourth language. So he is an author of this book. Today he is going to talk about. That is the Japanese book called the Weiquan Movement and the State in Contemporary China. As I said, political rights and political participation are complex concepts in the context of Chinese politics. China is not an authoritarian, China is not a democratic country, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that there is no participation. It doesn't mean there is no political rights, but they are restricted, and also they have a complex relationship with the state. So today we will learn interesting story of China's political rights movement from Dr. Mao-sung Wu. Please join me for welcoming Dr. Mao-sung Wu. So Dr. Wu, Mao-sung, it's yours.
First, I want to share my screen first.
Oh, yeah.
Do you find my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for your wonderful introduction. I'm delighted to have this opportunity today to share my research with the Tower Center community. Before starting my talk, allow me to express my gratitude to Tower Center, especially Professor Horfield and Professor Takeuchi. I can say that my research career in the United States would not be realized without your help and support. I have been able to study advanced at SMU, including English language. I would also like to thank Linda and Jeff. I learned a lot from you. Today, I'm going to talk about the rights protection movement in contemporary China, the People's Republic of China. This is the outline. First, I will use my research questions and methods in answering. Second, I would like to have a discussion from a historical perspective. I have been interested in the classical political science issues. That is, how does changing society influence political order? For the past nearly 20 years, I have tried to answer this question, mainly in case of modern China. As you know, the introduction of economic reforms has brought more than just wealth to China. Another inevitable result has also been more an awakening of people's rights. In China, the concept of rights has not been taken into account in traditional political culture for a long Chinese history. We can see this is a new movement in which people use a modern Western concept, especially the rights. After 1990s, people's resistance to the infringement of various rights and their demand to maintain them in various fields became known as the Weiquan Phenomena. Weiquan is a new Chinese term. In Chinese, it means to protect the rights. In my research, this term first appeared in the media in 1994. And after 2003, the Sun Zhigang incident, many media sources have since begun to apply this term as well. Additionally, scholars have also made use of this phrase, denominating it as a Weiquan activity, Weiquan phenomenon, or Weiquan movement. Of course, there were some great previous studies, such as O'Brien and Li Lianjiang, Yi Jianrong, Cai Yongsun, etc. But today, I can't introduce the fundamental research and their gap in detail. But I can say that there were also some unanswered questions, including not having an authoritative definition of the Weiquan movements, the influence of these movements on politics, and how did the states respond to these movements, etc. Therefore, I would like to answer following questions in my research. First, what are the Weiquan movements? I'm going to give a definition about Weiquan movement. Second, how did Weiquan movements influence Chinese politics? Finally, how did the states respond to Weiquan movement? My question starts with what, and then how did it develop? And why did that characteristic exist? Finally, I will discuss what implication it has in modern Chinese politics and history. This is my method and framework. My research had two stages. That's a case studies and comprehensive analysis. In the case studies, I use the actor-centered theory and rational choice theories. In the discussion, I use the historical institutionalism theory and framing theory. At one stage, I have carried out 5 case studies based on field work. Each case study is consumers, homeowners, taxi drivers, migrant workers, laborers, including petitioners, etc. In each case study, I mainly answered the following questions. Who? Why? For what? What to oppose? What kind of legitimacy base? And what action was taken? What kind of political character this has, etc. In other words, each element is actor, causes, issues, objectives, targets, methods, based for legitimacy, resources, and political opportunities, etc. There are 2 frameworks, one about the form of movement, and another about its influence on political process. About Weiquan forms, I divided into following types: personal resistance, collective action, social movement, revolution, or penetration of institutions. There are 3 types of influence on political process. The influence on the policy-making process, the influence of the political institution, and political stability. The policy-making process, I have subdivided into 6 processes: policy issue formation, deliberation, formulation, execution, evaluation, and change. This is the content of my case study. It took me nearly 10 years to complete this table. I apologize that is not English. I'm sorry. The findings are based on the case studies. First, I would like to define Weiquan acts in the narrow sense at this time. As a common definition, Weiquan acts are quasi-organized acts carried out by the stakeholders, individuals, or persons with the common interests whose legal interests and rights have been violated by the corporated acts or by unjustified state control or lack thereof in a certain area. Starting out protest against violation of interests and rights, which developed in the movement for citizens' basic rights. The Weiquan movement formed, became prominent, and changed over time. Weiquan activities appeared in some underlined forms. Personal resistance. This has been seen in the consumer actions or taxi driver actions. Collective action. This has been seen in the taxi drivers, migrant workers, laborers' activities. Social movement. This has been seen in the homeowners' activities. Penetration of institution. Although it is a rare case, there were cases of running for the local elections. Therefrom, consumers' movements, activists, and homeowners' activists. The form and influence on policymaking process follows the parts that have had a specific impact underlined. Policy issue formation, deliberation, execution, evaluation, and change. Today, I don't have time to introduce in detail. I have also found sometimes which movements collide with institutions. From this figure, we can see that petitioners and governments used petition system to collide with each other. It is a very serious problem in contemporary China. I have found the Weiquan movements, rights protection movements, born from consciousness of people's rights and interests in the process of modernization. I have been researching since 1998 and found that people gradually began to protect their livelihoods, pursue civil rights, and demand democracy. The Constitution was revised in 2004 to set out provisions such as respect for human rights and inviolability of legally acquired private assets. The revisions also provided a legal basis for the creation of Weiquan movements, establishing a mechanism for protecting the public interests. In December 2008, the proclamation of Chapter 08, in Chinese, 08宪章, was highly significant because it gave the fragmented Weiquan acts or movements a common political objective. Chapter 08 whose basic principles, the people's rights and democracy, have been grafted onto each other. One of the authors of Charter 08, Liu Xiaobo, was awarded the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize. It's first time to Chinese award Nobel Peace Prize. You may still remember it. The Weiquan movement is the civil rights movement based on people's livelihood, creating the potential of a democratic movement. The Toll Liability Law of the People's Republic of China in July 2010 codified the public interests under civil law and gave the government the legal rights to pursue those responsible for unlawful acts. This can be viewed as a move by the government to confine Weiquan activities to the civil sphere. Meanwhile, the government also created its own Weiquan discourse and Weiquan model and began to crack down on any Weiquan activities deviating from its interpretation and model. In March 2013, the government arrested activists in the New Citizen Movement. In Chinese, is 新公民运动. Lawyers and activists advocating a new people's movement to promote a more mature social and political climate through the realization of rights set out by the law and demanding protection of citizens' rights and political reform through peaceful means such as freedom of expression, freedom of association, and exercise of the rights to vote. The activities were detained. In July 2015, the government began crackdown on Weiquan activists, arresting over 300 Weiquan lawyers and activists throughout the country. The state side started a campaign of negative discourse against the Weiquan discourse in the media. And rising tensions with the government, the Weiquan movement has reached a critical point. Let me introduce in a little more detail. Conditions in the early 1980s, when China shifted in earnest to a market economy, were ripe for the both of movements as beneficiaries. Diversified and illegal acts were pervasive in the early stage of the shift to the market economy. Laws were drawn up and enacted to prevent abuse, changing public consciousness of rights and raising awareness of the lack of mechanism to protect those rights. In the 1990s, media organizations became more commercially and socially oriented. Cyberspace developed and spread rapidly. Public intellectuals emerged, and activity by grassroots, NGOs, lawyers, and others increased, setting the stage for the movement's formation. In the 2000s, conditions were in place for rights protection activities to arise in various spheres. The focus of those activities shifted from interest to the rights, and from the private realm to the quasi-private, quasi-public, and finally to the public realms. And protests turned into demands. As I mentioned, the Constitution was revised, also provided a legal basis for the creation of the Weiquan movement, establishing a mechanism for protecting the public interests. Some media, intellectuals, and organizations involved in public activities joined in as they identified with Weiquan as a concept and were motivated by the struggles of some individuals whose rights has been infringed. The movement spread through society and all kinds of Weiquan activities, arrests into the emerging Weiquan movement. This was the decades from the 1990s to the 2000s when the Weiquan movements emerged as a people's rights movement rooted in civil society. This was also a time when opinion favorable to the protection of legal rights began to emerge. Additionally, thanks to the active support of intellectuals and social activists, including lawyers or social groups, including some from outside China, the movement began to advance democracy as a political value and goal. I mentioned the recent trend toward crackdown from the states in previous slide, so I would repeat it here. Not only did the government establish its own interpretation of Weiquan and take the initiative in the Weiquan activities, they embarked on direct repression of the Weiquan movement. To sum up, the 1990s were the preparatory stage for the Weiquan movement, and the 1990s were the time when necessary conditions formed and gradually emerged. In the 2000s, civil rights movements arose based on the livelihood in various fields. However, in recent years, the Weiquan movement has encountered a national crackdown and is entering a critical phase. It will be necessary to keep a close eye on future developments. Here, I want to emphasize that when the Weiquan movement started, the state was the initiator and supporter of the Weiquan movement. The state makes laws, education, and popularization of legal knowledge to let people know what legal rights are and how to use legal means to protect the legal rights of the individuals. However, when Weiquan movements developed and its goal gradually changed from individuals, enterprises, and local governments, the states began to control it. Differently, the states recognized that it is necessary to safeguard legal rights, but it wants to limit the rights protection activities within the sphere of civil rights. If Weiquan movements have political goals and political values, and it conflicts with the current political values and principles, the states suppress and consolidate them. The 11 years prison sentences of Liu Xiaobo, who drafted Chapter 08, is a typical example of this. At present, the rights protection behavior is only limited to the civil scope designed by the state in China now. In contrast, this influence has also changed the Weiquan movement side, from the original being non-violent, the principle of the first issue began to emphasize the right to resistance and even talk about anti-regime and revolution. This is often seen mainly in the discourse of activities fleeing abroad in outside China. In a few cases, activists in exile in the United States have transformed into Trump supporters. The conclusion, this is my book that was published in 2015 in Japanese. Professor Takaouchi mentioned that. The title is The Weiquan Movement and the State in Contemporary China in horizontal writing. Based on my findings about Weiquan movements, there are three basic concepts. People's livelihoods. In Chinese, is 民生. I wrote it in the left side. Civil rights, 民权, in the middle. And democracy, 民族, in the left side in vertical writing. This cover has two meanings. First, the essence of the rights movements is a civil rights movement based on people's livelihood. With the passage of time, it's gradually evolved into the possibility of democratization. The size, express, the purpose of movements has been changing. Second, I wrote democracy in a very broad sense of the word. The cover of the book can't fully contain the word democracy. This means that current political regime in China can guarantee people's livelihood and civil rights, but can't guarantee democratic values and movements. I wrote those words and designed the book cover to want to be a symbolic representation of a certain aspect of Chinese politics. The tension lay between an increasingly diversifying society and the parties and the government's demands for centralization. Finally, I want to provide the historical perspective to understand contemporary China and predict China's future direction. Going forward, research into the significance of Weiquan movements in modern Chinese history will be necessary. This will require a historical perspective. The example of Japan's modernization can be a worthwhile reference for the understanding China. After making a provisional conclusion about Weiquan movements, I have been studying Japan's modern and contemporary history for several years. I want to know, how did the democratization of politics in Japan come about? How were Japanese voters born? And how did Japan's liberalism arise? Looking back over Japan's modern history from the Meiji Restoration, the freedom and the people's rights movements, and Daisho democracy to democracy in post-war Japan, we can see that there has been a process of learning about democracy with manifested itself in different ways, from demands for the enfranchisement among local elite to a spring consciousness of modern rights among the public, which eventually gave birth to a modern citizenry and potential voters. This movement developed not just through social activities and political movements, but also through literature. In particular, many aspects and contradictions of Daisho democracies are similar to those of the Weiquan movement's period in China. Even there are 100 years time gap. There were structural contradictions in two periods. In Japan's case, the tension was between social change during the Daisho democratic years and the political system, centering on the emperor system. In China, the tension lay between an increasingly diversifying society and the party demands for centralization. The dynamism of Daisho democracy was later mobilized for the external expansion under militarism and absorbed into the unified political system of nationalism. But it's clear that this period laid the foundations for the development of post-war democracy. You know, Japan is one of the democratic countries. Now, Daisho democracy as a reference point, I would like to present my hypothesis on Weiquan democracy. The term Weiquan democracy refers to the period from the 1990s to around 2015, when the Weiquan movements and the resulting discourse on rights was born, developed, and changed in the broad segments of society in the People's Republic of China, PRC. This was a series of struggles and demands to assert various interests in response to infringement of rights. To support this hypothesis, the next step in my research will be to link the 100 Days Reform, 戊戌 Reform. In Chinese is 戊戌变法，百日维新，是维新，不是维权。Led by some pioneering intellectuals in the late Qing dynasty, with the Weiquan democracy of the 100 years later, to trace the path of the China's political modernization and show a direction for the constitutional government, which is still a work in progress. Although pessimism is spreading now, but I believe that the social change generated by the economic modernization up to now will be a source of future political dynamism. We need to think with a historical perspective, especially think about China. I will stop here. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Mao-song, actually, let's start this slide, keep this slide, and then tell us what this slide means, especially that the paper airplane represents. The meaning of this slide, yeah.
Yeah. So it's what I want to show one thing. The Weiquan movement is born in China, inside China, but now some Weiquan activists to go to outside. So it's rooted in China, but now some in the European United States. So I went to some activists to return to China. So I went to the airplane, go back to mainland. So, and I also like, thank you, Japan Airlines. Thank you.
Well, so I'd like to start with one question, which actually is also related to one of the questions that has been raised from the audience. So those if you have a question, please write it write them in the Q&A box, and I will try to take them as much as possible. Actually, my question was also raised by Mr. Hiroki Akita of Nikkei Shimbun. Akita-san asks, so my question is actually one word which we usually hear very often if we hear about Chinese politics, but you do not mention at all. That is Xi Jinping. And so as long as I recall, you didn't say one time at all. You didn't say at all Xi Jinping. So how is the Weiquan movement under Xi Jinping? And then Akita-san's question of what will be the long-term prospect of Weiquan movement under Xi Jinping administration?
Yeah, it's a great question. I appreciate you insight. I didn't mention about Xi Jinping, including Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. Yeah, but in my presentation, I mentioned it's recent years. It's mainly to say Xi Jinping era. Since the new era in China is a new era. China has tightened control regulation on speech, social organizations, foreign NGOs, the internet, and lawyers, while giving top priority to nation's security. And its centralized management by the CCP is becoming prominent. So it is, I didn't mention his name, but it's mainly recent years, the Weiquan reached a critical point during a new era. And the second question, I think the social movements in the Xi Jinping era maybe it's just controlled by the civil sphere. Some political participation or some legal rights protection behavior. I don't say which behavior. The rights protection behavior just controlled by the civil scope. It's designed by the government.
Good, thank
Does
you.
that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. So, so Xi Jinping came into power in 2013, and then, according to your research, the Weiquan movement started being cracked down around at the same time, around 2013. Another movement that occurred around that time, actually in following year in 2014, is Hong Kong's umbrella movements. Dr. Naoko Eto, our friend, thank you for joining us, Eto-san. So she asked the question of, is there any relationship between the Weiquan movement and the Hong Kong's umbrella movement?
Thank you, Edo-san. It's a great question. Yeah, umbrella movement is happened in 2015. So it's after the crackdown in mainland China to the movement. But in my research, when I practiced my fieldwork, so Hong Kong in the 2000s, not 2000 after New Era, there have some relationship within Hong Kong activities and the Chinese activities. And Hong Kong, some NGOs to education, to create some program for the education, China's NGO activities. But now it's impossible. So it's not directly have a relationship with the Weiquan movement and the Hong Kong umbrella movement, but in the roots, there was have a same framework, same purpose with contemporary China.
Yeah, thank you. David Kam, Tower Center student, Tower Center forum member, asked the question of the influence on the policy and regulation on foreign joint venture projects. So you raised a lot of, you have, and throughout your case studies, you have gathered a lot of the cases, a lot of the examples of a Weiquan movement. And then now, since 2013, so there's a pushback on Weiquan movement. So does it affect the policy and regulation on foreign joint venture projects and the companies operating in China? So is it somehow related to the retreat of internationalism in China?
Yes, I think it's a relationship. So I can show one fact in in 2016, August, the government to, 2016 April, the government to control, to to build one law to control foreign NGO activities in mainland China. I think it's very directly linked with your questions. So, as I mentioned, in the process, some outside the source, which need to use outside the source and also outside activities to, they say, is empowerment to support some Weiquan movements, including Europe NGOs, including United States NGOs. But the central government want to cut this relationship. So they're just a fair internal, inner social movement linked with foreign resource.
Thank you. Jim Horfield, director of the Tower Center, asked the question of quite fundamental question. So is the Weiquan movement a complete failure? And then the regime has consolidated its power and repressed all dissent. So is that the wrong conclusion? Or so is it a failure, or do you see some success?
Yeah, it's thank you, Professor Horfield. Yeah, appreciate you. So I don't. It's difficult to say it's a success or failure, but I think now the central control is very directly for its factor, its sector. So, but the people recognize what is rights and understand what is how to keep their rights and how to demand the rights. So now I think the society just keep in very slow position. But why I finally to give a historical position, historical perspective to look contemporary China, the current Chinese politics use the 100 years ago Japan's case. So as I mentioned, Daisho democracy, after Daisho democracy, Japan become more centralism country. There, the governments control all of the society. But post-war, the society have opportunity to express their own behavior. So I think the introduction of economic development and the social have changed, but this changing have a very strong implication in Chinese politics. We need to pay a long span to watch this Chinese change. So I know it's not answer the question is a success or failure, but I think Weiquan movement have a potential to change the Chinese politics and to push the political political modernization.
That's actually both like how should I say pessimistic and optimistic perspective on the implication of political rights movement, because if you compare it with the Taisho democracy, so after Taisho democracy, what happened is a rising nationalism, and then like Japan went ahead to militarism, and Japan fought a war, and then but the post-war democracy of Japan actually is rooted in the Taisho democracy. That's actually what like many political scientists and historians working on Japan have concluded. So so that's actually in that sense that in the long term, like there is some more optimistic perspective, but at the same time, in the short term, it seems that we need to be worried, especially given that nationalism is rising in China right now. One like a big question actually raised by Akita-san, that is what will be the long-term impact of Weiquan movement on political stability in China? And then this is a very important question for especially for political scientists who are working on China. So we usually say that the Chinese government has given some rights to protest, and then it actually strengthens the authoritarian regime. It has brought stability, but now it seems that Xi Jinping administration is changing the course and then turning away from giving more political rights to the people. So how do you think, like what will be the long-term impact of Weiquan movement and its suppression of Weiquan movement on political stability in China?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very important question to how to link the political stability. But when if I answer this question, we need to long how long we have the historical span to watch that. So before I answer this question, why I changed my method and framework to watch this watch a movement. In the case studies, I just used the actor-centered theory and the rational choice theory, but I find the limitation to use this perspective to watch China as a. We can say that it's a success or it's flawed, but we just can catch one moment, but we can't understand the long potential. So when I changed the historical institutionalism theory towards China, I can say that I think now Chinese legitimacy from the top government from the CCP, but if the China, the mainland China, want to keep a very long span political stability, they need to get some resource, some legitimacy from society. So how to design how to design this system is a very important thing. But I know democracy is one of the options, but China have very long history and very big country. I think we have another imagination to think about how to government to receive or get some legitimacy from society, a different kind of society. It's a big question, but I want to believe if it is our homework for the political science, but scientists, but if China wants to keep a long span political stability, which movement maybe have a very important thing. They have some experience to understand what is their right, how to express and how to demand that. If there's no this experience become one option as a democratic country, I think maybe have another bad situation in this case. So, and I want to add one thing. So now Chinese politics use the power to keep very short time. Maybe it's become a long-term political stability, but the order and the freedom have tense relationship. I think is have a good balance or is cycle. So it is one standard I to judge what is the Chinese what is political stability. So I want to keep this cycle, not just use the order to control freedom, not just to emphasize freedom to unchip the order. They need to interaction each other, interactive with each other.
So one question from Seeker One, our colleague teaching at the SMU Theology School. So he asked a question about Christianity. So many Weiquan lawyers he knows or he follows are self-professed Christians. And to what extent does Christianity play a part in the Weiquan movement historically? And to what extent might Christianity play a part in the future of human rights in China?
Yeah, it is very important question. I know it's very important when we talk about which movement, but my research have a lot of limitation. As I mentioned, my case study just five years. I didn't care the rural side, and I also didn't care the legislation side. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have empirical evidence to answer your question because I didn't. I think this is very important question, but I didn't to use some method to answer this question. So let's it become my next homework. I'm sorry, I understand. I don't understand your answer, but I understand it's a very important question, but I don't have empirical evidence to answer this question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, actually, it's difficult to study this as social scientifically because many of them do not say they are Christians officially, but like as Seeker has heard, many lawyers, Weiquan lawyers, say that actually they are Christians. So it's actually. We can hear a lot of rumors here and there, but at the same time, it's difficult to study it as using social science methods. Yeah. So I'd like to ask go ahead.
Let me add one question. Even I didn't do do some field work in this area, but some, as Professor Takaouchi mentioned, some Western lawyers and some activities use this use this network to mobilize some this. So it is one field to one resource and also one network to this movement. I can see.
So, yeah. So I'd like to give you a kind of big question as a last question based on some of the questions that we have received. So one question asks, so what livelihoods represent a challenge to the Chinese regime? So livelihoods is one of the three concepts that you introduced, you wrote, showed in your title of the cover of the book. That's actually Ming Sheng. And then another question from Adam Brown, our student, asks, is the rising strength of China's burgeoning middle class, does it present within the rising diversity, as you mentioned? So I think that a rising middle class, increasing the middle class people, that's actually one important situation, important phenomenon. So in that sense, Chinese regime, authoritarian regime solves the problem, many of the problems of the livelihood. That's why, like, you can see, like, this in the book title. Interestingly, the last one, this is the Ming Sheng livelihoods, is within the title. Ming Chuan, the political rights, that's actually the civil rights is within the cover. But the last one, like the biggest one, Mingzhu, that's democracy, is like cannot fit to the framework of the cover, which suggests that democracy cannot fit to the framework of authoritarian regime. That's what Dr. Wu suggests by choosing this cover. So my question is really like, so now rising civil society, and then the rising diversity, and then the Chinese authoritarian regime gives more political rights to the people. But now, is it like is it possible for Chinese government to give political rights to the people and avoiding democratization?
Yeah, it is a very important question. So middle class, when we talk about middle class, so some middle class is the society is the diversity class is increasing now. That middle class, what situation middle class to feeling satisfied? Now they can depends on this political regime. They can get some wealthy, and they can gain some political rights, limited political rights. But if they think this relations between government with regime with this political regime couldn't give them some benefits, it is one turning point. So in another word, the government, the state side want to keep them to involve them in the inside of the power center. So, but one thing, the China keep the economic development to share some benefits for the middle class, another and even another class. It depends on this condition, this situation. So when we think about the middle class, how to change the social movement, before we think that, we have to think one proper condition. How what kind of situation the middle class exist now. But I know it's not answer your question, but I want to give one more question for me think it together. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Yeah, well, actually, I don't expect that you can give a complete answer immediately now. It's a very complex issue and a very fundamental issue in Chinese authoritarian politics. So we often talk about U.S.-China trade war when we talk about China. But actually, I always say that when Xi Jinping wakes up in the morning, the first thing that he has to worry about is domestic stability. And the issue that Dr. Wu talked about today is actually exactly the issue that the Chinese leader has to keep thinking about every day, actually, because that is actually directly related to their regime's resilience. However bad U.S.-China relationship becomes, it will not lead to the collapse of the regime immediately. But if the Chinese authoritarian regime mishandles the domestic stability, then it will directly it will impact the resilience of the regime. So that's why Xi Jinping really has to worry about this issue. So we talked a lot, we heard a lot about the most fundamental issue of Chinese politics. Thank you very much, Dr. Wu, and please join me for thanking Dr. Wu.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wu. That was
Thank you
amazing.
for having me. Thank you.
Of course. No, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. And thank you, Hiroki, for being a great moderator as always. And thank you to everyone who attended today's program. So please go on our website and see what we have for the last upcoming semester of our spring semester for 2021. And please do and sign up and attend our programs. And we wish you all a great evening, afternoon, and morning. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.